Food for Thought podcast, which is in its 18th year, is brought to you by the listeners of this podcast. That means you. Thank you so much for valuing this podcast by becoming a supporter. You can do so at patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau, or you could just go to joyfulvegan.com and you can click on the donate button. Today's episode is supplemented by support from Plain Products, a vegan-owned company offering cruelty-free, zero-waste, personal care products, free of animal products that I use for my hair, for my face, for my body. They offer shampoos, conditioners, body washes, lotions, face lotions, body lotions, and so much more. Plain Products packages all of their personal care products in eco-friendly refillable bottles that you return empty, and you use the prepaid sticker to do so when you're done, so they can sanitize them and refill them. It's so convenient, it's so innovative, and yet it's so simple. And they are literally closing the loop on waste. You can visit joyfulvegan.com/hair now to get your exclusive 15% off discount link. 15% off every time you use that link and the code that's over at joyfulvegan.com/hair. Use it every time you order. Use it once. I know you're going to become a fan. And thank Plain Products for sponsoring this episode. Today's topic is the language of meat, how the words we choose disguise or reveal what we're eating. Hi everyone, I hope you're doing fabulously well. So this is fun. A version of this episode aired in, wait for it, 2006, 18 years ago. 18 years ago, folks. How amazing is that? Some of you have been listening since 2006. Some of you have a lot of catching up to do, but I've decided to re-record some older episodes, not because the content became stale. The content on this episode is evergreen, but I don't know. CPG, Colleen Patrick-Goudreau, 18 years ago is different than CPG today. My voice is different. My understanding of the world is different. Just the way I want to convey this information to you is a little different. And so I wanted to make sure the content stays fresh and relevant, because I can repeat this again and again and again. And there's always going to be new listeners who find it, especially as it shows up at the top of people's queues. There are a lot of podcasts to listen to these days. I know you're all busy, so I'm grateful to you for listening to this. And I want to make it easier for people to find content that I think is really relevant, that I think is really interesting, and that I think it might be helpful in deepening your understanding of our relationship with other animals. So that's why I re-recorded this episode that originally aired 18 years ago. Now, before we get started, just a couple quick things, a couple announcements. I've just added a holiday cooking class, which is gingerbread house making. So you're going to learn recipes for the gingerbread itself, for royal icing, as well as for the construction of and the decoration of making a gingerbread house. Of course, it's vegan, plant-based, all of it. So head over to joyfulvegan.com and click on recipes and classes for that. Number 2, quick announcement. I am often asked about my techniques for staying joyful and hopeful when world events feel dark and heavy. And I've shared a lot with you on this podcast, of course. This could be for when you're going through difficult times as an advocate and you see things not going the way you want them to, et cetera, et cetera. So many people have requested a workshop or conference on this topic. So I am gauging interest for a late October, early November 2024 online conference. If you are interested in coming together to explore how to find light and hope, even in the most challenging times, head over to joyfulvegan.com/events, or just click on events and at least add your name and email address to the list, so I know you're interested in learning more, and I will let you know. Number 3, we have confirmed our June 25 trip to the Dordogne Valley in France. We're going to be going to Lascaux Caves. We're going to be on the Dordogne River. We're going to have a fabulous time. This is the second time we're doing this trip, and there are spots available. And we have also confirmed our late September, early October 2025 trip to Croatia. We have our own yacht. There are a couple cabins left, and I would love you to join us. So if you're interested in either of these incredible adventures with me, go to joyfulvegan.com and book your spot today. You can also just go to joyfulvegantrips.com. Everything's at joyfulvegan.com. That's basically it. Although there's one more announcement I'm going to make, which is not at joyfulvegan.com, even though I will add it there. And that is a new event. If you're local, of the East Bay Animal Pack. Many of you know I co-founded a political action committee for animals here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we're having an endorsement meeting for those candidates we will be endorsing or not. And as a member, you can vote as well. You can be a member, by the way. You don't have to be in the San Francisco Bay Area. So anybody can become a member at eastbayanimalpack.org. And it helps us to vote for and endorse candidates who are animal friendly and to oppose those who are not. So anybody can support this, anybody can become a member, and you have a vested interest if you are in the San Francisco Bay Area. And if you are, we're going to be having our endorsement meeting in September. So just head over to eastbayanimalpack.org, certainly become a member if you wish. And if you're in the Bay Area, you'll get more information about the event. So make sure you're on the mailing list. Okay. I, like many people, believe that our choice of words reflects our beliefs and reflects our values and reveals a lot about who we are and what we believe. And I'm not a proponent of what is derisively referred to as politically correct language, but I do make an effort to use words that say what they mean, that reflect the truth rather than conceal the truth. At the same time, I'm aware that when communicating about difficult subjects like our abuse of animals and our consumption of animals, my intention is to be effective and not just accurate. So what I want to do today is explore the idea that when it comes to what we eat, we've done a really good job of choosing words that mask what we're really eating. Probably precisely because it makes us uncomfortable to confront the reality of what we're really consuming and thus what we're actually supporting. Now, most of us are pretty comfortable with the word meat. We hear it all the time, and for most people, it's not a loaded word. If I ask you if you eat meat, you wouldn't skip a beat. You would say yes or no. You wouldn't think the word meat is offensive. And yet I struggle with this word. I don't struggle with the word. I actually have a very intimate relationship with this word, but I don't use the word meat on its own to refer to either animal flesh or what people derisively call fake meat, plant-based meat. So the reason I have an intimate relationship with this word meat is because I embrace using it to refer to plants versus animals. So I will say plant-based meat versus animal-based meat. Now, there are a lot of reasons I do this, one of which has to do with the historical meaning of the word meat, which in Old English and even in early modern English referred to all food, before that word meat became narrowed to refer only to animal flesh, and whose remnants remain in our English language when we talk about the meat of a nut or coconut meat, or even the expression getting to the meat of the matter. That means to get to the substance of a thing, substance meaning food. So that expression did not originally refer to animal flesh. So I prefer to distinguish between plant-based meat and animal-based meat because otherwise, when we just say meat, the animal is absent from that word and from our minds when we just say meat. In fact, to further this point, in Old English, which remember is rooted in Germanic languages, English is a Germanic language. If the word meat, in Old English it would have been mete, M-E-T-E, meant all food, then what words in Old English connoted animal meat, right? Surely they had a word to convey animals who were eaten. Well, they did. And that word was flesh. Fleisch, Fleische in Old English. So meta, meat, would have been used to talk about food in general, and Fleisch, would have been used to convey the consumption of dead animals. And it was used to form compound words in order to distinguish one type of animal flesh from another, just as it's done in the German language today. So in Old English, you would have the word pig, but you would mostly in Old English, they would have used the word swine, which would have been pronounced sween. You would have had the word cow, which would have been pronounced coo, you would have had the word steer, which would have been pronounced steor. You would have had the word ox, typically ox. You would have had the word bull or bulla. You would have had the word sheep or shop. You would have had the word calf or calf. You would have had the word lamb, which would have sounded the same. You would have had the word hen or henna. You would have had the word vogel, which would have been fowl or bird, and so on. And these are the words for the living animals in Old English, right? Cow, sheep, bull, ox, steer, swine. These are the words for the living animals in Old English. But to refer to the meat of these animals, because of course they were eating these animals, Old English did what Old English did, which is put two words together to create a compound word. So you put together the name of the animal with the word flesh. I'm just going to do this in modern English. So you have cow flesh, swine flesh, sheep flesh, deer flesh. Right. So they needed a way to distinguish between the living animal and the animal they were eating. So they wouldn't have just said swine for swine. They wouldn't have just said Kuh. They would have said Kuhfleisch and Swinefleisch. And we have that in German today. So similar compounds are used. So for pork, and I'm going to get to the word pork, in German, you would say Schweinefleisch. So pig flesh, swine. You would say Huhnfleisch, like hen flesh, for chicken, for instance. So in both Old English and German, these compound words, compound terms, directly indicate the type of meat by combining the animal's name with the word for flesh, showing the clear link between the animal and the, I'll say, food that comes from the animal, the flesh that comes from the animal. Now, the word flesh today is really tricky in English because I think a lot of people may find the word offensive if, I say to you, do you eat flesh? As opposed to saying, do you eat meat? So if I said, do you eat meat? Most people would say yes or no. If I say, do you eat animal flesh? People might have a little bit of a reaction to that. Now, I tend to use the word flesh and fluids. I was going to say not to be provocative. Of course, I am trying to be a little provocative. Like I want to provoke thought. I'm not trying to be offensive. And I have found that in the right context, with the right tone, I do think using flesh, with or without fluids, can be really effective. I think it can pull people out of the desensitization that a word like meat can create and perpetuate. Now, I wouldn't say to someone, do you eat flesh? It would be more in the context of talking about myself, to be honest. So people say, oh, you're vegan, however it comes up. I do tend to incorporate it into my own story about how I don't eat animal flesh and fluids. And people hear that in a way that is not combative. And it tends to resonate. It has not backfired on me. I tend to say it very genuinely and very casually. And it does then offer an in to talking about language and how fascinating the English language is and how we used to use these words and how in German that's the word you would use. And so I actually find that it can be helpful. But you can see what I'm saying here is that you still have to tread carefully and be aware that it could backfire and it could be something that people find offensive. And when I'm having these conversations with people and I'm presenting, whether I'm having a conversation or I'm presenting it in an article or in a radio editorial or in a podcast, I am mindful that it could provoke a reaction. So I'm just really conscious about how I say it and how I couple it. Now, you could say the same thing about words like corpse and carcass and dead animal and body parts. In that, well, why can't you use those words? Those words they're accurate, and that would get people thinking. But I don't think they have the same efficacy as the word flesh. Yes, they're accurate. Yes, it's true. But whereas with the word flesh, I can talk more about the etymology of it and the history of the English language and how that impacts our current choice of words, I don't think the same can be said of corpse and carcass. I think those are very much combative, and I think people hear that and they get turned off. So for me, choosing the words that I choose has to do with how people will respond to them. So, I always say, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective, right? And in the case of flesh, I think it's also right and effective. In the case of saying to someone, I don't eat corpses, or I don't eat carcasses, or I don't eat, I think that can really turn people off. And while I'm looking to provoke thought, I'm not looking to close down and shut down a conversation or a relationship. And again, context matters, relationship matters, tone matters, place and time matter. So it is a matter of being mindful of it. But isn't it interesting? Meat has completely lost its charge. It doesn't have the same charge as something like flesh kind of does sometimes with people. So the animal plus fleisch plus flesh was used to talk about the different types of animal meat eaten. And it wasn't until the Norman French invaded England in 1066 that there was an eventual shift that we still see today, where we have one word for the living animal. And I have an entire podcast episode on how all of the words we have for the living animals are all Old English words, which I find very interesting. And then we have one word for the flesh of that animal that we consume. And most of those words, not all of them, but most of those words come in from French, Norman French. And those are words like beef and pork and bacon and ham and mutton and veal and venison and poultry and game and sausage, all of which came into English from French, most of which came in when the Normans arrived and then stayed and ruled in this Anglo-Saxon speaking land. So when I talk about Old English, that's Anglo-Saxon. And those are the words for all those living animals, the cow and the sheep and the calf and the bull and the steer, and all of those are Old English words, where now we had the Norman French and French, through Latin also, bring their own words for the different animal meats. So when the Normans came, they either brought their own words for the different animal meats, so they would have said venison, or they brought the French words, the Norman French words, for the living animals that in English became the word for the dead flesh of that animal. So, for instance, mouton, it's mouton, was the Norman French word for a living sheep. And in English, it became mutton. Veau, V-E-A-U, was Norman French for a young calf, not for a dead calf, but for a young living calf was veau. And so veal came to be the English word for the dead young calf. So some of the words were actually just the Norman French words for the animals themselves. But many of the words were Norman French for the flesh of those animals. Now, psychologically, you could argue, and I do, that because these words come from a language other than English, other than Old English, Anglo-Saxon, they serve as a mask. In other words, we don't use the Old English words to refer to the animals we eat. We don't say we eat cows or bulls or oxen or steer. We say beef. So cows and bulls and oxen and steer are Old English. Beef is French. We don't say we eat calves, which is Old English. We say we eat veal. We don't say we eat pigs or swine or hogs or sows. I'm thinking of all of these Old English words for a porcine animal. We say we eat pork, which is French. We don't say we eat deer. Well, deer was definitely an Old English word, but the words that would have been used for the animal we now think of as a deer would have been a hart or a hind, referring to the male or the female version of this animal. The word deer actually is an Old English word, but interestingly, and I do have a podcast episode on this, the word deer used to be the word that connoted all wild animals before it was narrowed down to our modern understanding of the word to refer to the animal we recognize today as deer. But we don't say hart. We don't even say harts and hinds anymore. Those words just fell out of use. So now that word deer that referred to all wild animals got narrowed down to that one particular kind of animal, and harts and hinds fell off completely. But we don't say we eat harts or hinds or deer. We say we eat venison, which is French. So hart, hind, deer, Old English, venison, French. So if I were to say out loud to someone at the dinner table, how are you enjoying the pig? Or how are you enjoying the bull? Or how are you enjoying the baby calf? It would be considered offensive. It would be considered a combative. Much more acceptable is asking how are you enjoying the pork? How are you enjoying the beef or the veal? And while the people being ruled by the Norman French, so the peasants, which have been mostly the peasants, during this entire span of time that the Normans were ruling, and French was Norman French, and then French was taking over Anglo-Saxon, or at least incorporating into their vocabulary. The people were not using these words because they were disguising the fact that they were eating animals. But that is the effect of it today, I think. I think there's a good argument to be made that the word beef today can serve as a euphemism so that we're not thinking about the living animal. And I think that's worth talking about, and I think it's worth unpacking. And that also goes for other foreign words, straight from other languages, that make animal parts seem more edible and in some cases exotic. So the word caviar, even though it means fish eggs in Turkish, if I were to say to you, would you like some fish eggs? It doesn't have the same appeal, mostly, as caviar does. We have foie gras, which means fat liver in French, but you hear foie gras and it has this kind of exotic aspect to it. And I'll get to how the French could obviously listen. They know what foie gras means and they don't have a problem eating fat liver. We have the same tropes in English where we could say I eat chicken and I'm not offended by it, right? So I'll get there. We have a word like tripe, which comes from Old French for intestines. We have the word pâté, which actually just means paste, but you hear these words and they have kind of an exoticism to them. And again, the animal is removed from them. And that's the case, I think, with like pepperoni, salami, prosciutto, chorizo, charcuterie, confit, kebab. All of these are loan words, which means they come into English pretty much intact and they have the same pronunciation and the same spelling, etc., as they would in their original language. And I think the effect of these non-English words, but being incorporated into the English language, can have the effect of masking the fact that we're eating intestines and livers and fish eggs and sausage and et cetera, et cetera. Now, interestingly, there are some body parts or whole animals that we don't mask at all, and we seem to have no problem eating. As I said, foie gras means fat liver, and in French, it means fat liver, and the French know that and still eat it and don't have a problem. It's not masked at all. But we do have the same instances in English, and I want to talk about those. But first, I want to acknowledge all of you who are supporting this podcast in general, and some heroes and angels in particular. Heroes like Simon Small, Angelica Torres Lofton, Karma Whitford, Jennifer Statmiller. I want to thank angels like Risa Rybakov, Brooke Boussard, PJ Schuster, Tina Atwell, Elizabeth D., and Ranjini Mohan. If you have heard the same names for years, it's because these people have been supporting me at the highest levels for years. And if you would like to add your name to the list and be included here and get some perks, but just know that you are supporting this work, please head over to patreon.com and upgrade if you're already a member, and pledge if you're not yet a member. You can also just go to joyfulvegan.com and click on the donate button. And just a note, do all of this on the desktop version of Patreon. Apple is now increasing their charges for people who become pledging members on the Patreon app in the Apple Store. So you don't want to be charged more, and I don't want to be charged more. So if you become a new Patreon, do so over at the desktop version, patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau, or you can get that link over at joyfulvegan.com. Just click on donate. So thank you so much for your support. And thanks to everybody who's been supporting me for a very long time. So let's look at some specific body parts we're somehow able to refer to and eat without squeamishness, such as when we order ribs, short ribs, wings, legs, breasts, rumps, necks, oxtail even. And don't forget the loins, a specific cut of meat, which is what all of these are. These are cuts of meat from the back of an animal, extending from the ribs to the pelvis. And from that, we also have short loin and sirloin and tenderloin. Even the words themselves just lose their charge. They lose their meaning because we hear them so often, right? Other cuts, and again, that's what they are. That's what they refer to. Another term I think we've been conditioned to not think of as the mutilated body parts of an animal. We say cuts, right? Other cuts include terms that do refer to body parts, but they're a bit more hidden than leg and breast. So you have shank, which is cut from the lower leg of an animal. Flank, which is cut from the lower abdomen of a cow or a steer. You have chuck, which is cut from the shoulder area of a cow or a steer. You have a brisket, which is cut from the chest or lower front of a cow or steer. You have the round, right? A round. Sometimes it's round chuck, cut from the rear leg of a steer or a cow. And you have hocks, cut from the lower part of the leg, often used in soups and stews, like ham hocks. You also have the term for a collection of ribs, and that is the word rack. So we often say a rack of lamb. That word rack refers to the collection of ribs. So my theory about why we're able to say something like, I'll have the baby back ribs, is simply use. From use, these terms have become normalized. And they lose their charge, and they lose their meaning, and the animals are absent from them. And frankly, the consumption of these particular body parts has also become normalized, such that we don't really associate them with the animals anymore. Overuse has desensitized us. But when we hear about others, other cultures, other countries, other people eating the brains or the tongues or the feet or the heads or the stomachs or the genitalia of other animals, we tend to have a visceral reaction to that. Why? Because it's cultural. What is cultural is normalized. What is normalized is taken for granted, becomes status quo, and its impact becomes obscured by familiarity, which leads to desensitization, where we don't think about the implications, where we don't, want to think about the animals, right? So it's relative. It's all relative, obviously. One person's cruelty is another person's norm, but just because it's status quo doesn't mean it's right or ethical or compassionate or reflective of our values. But really, honestly, how different is eating a dismembered leg from eating a dismembered head? I mean, it's all relative. The point is the use of the words like, I'll have a chicken breast. The reason it doesn't move us to think, what the heck am I eating? is because it's so familiar that we become desensitized to it. And so our language can resensitize the desensitized parts of us. And I often use the example of a subtle change, such as changing the singular to the plural, that can really pull us and other people who are listening out of this desensitization. It can resensitize us when we say something like chickens instead of chicken. So if I said to you, do you eat chicken? You would say, I eat chicken. I love chicken. But if I say, do you eat chickens? You might say, I don't eat chicken. Somehow putting that S, just making it plural, can put the animal back into that word. But because we've used the word chicken or turkey or duck or goose or quail, right? These singular uses of these words of the animals, that has desensitized us to the animal there. But when we put the plural back in, the animal's back. It's just so interesting. So do you eat turkey? Yeah, I eat turkey. Do you eat turkeys? What? No, I don't eat turkeys, right? Do you eat goose? Yeah, we have a Christmas goose every year. Do you eat geese? No, I don't. No, I don't eat geese. Do you eat duck? Yes, I eat duck. Do you eat ducks? No, I don't eat ducks, right? So that idea, it resensitizes us. It resensitizes the animals. I mean, or I should say it reanimates the words. It reanimates the animals. I mean, that word animate and animal, they're related words. So that can also be the case when we talk about fishes. Fish. So the word fishes, it is grammatically correct to say fishes, but when we say fish, that's singular, it just also takes the animal out of that word. We say fishes, it puts the animals back. And we can do the same thing by pluralizing the specific animals. Instead of saying trout, we could say trouts. And yes, it's grammatically correct. All of these are grammatically correct. Not that it matters. We can all make up new words. But to be consistent with the language that exists, because I'm not looking to create a whole new language, we can say trouts. We can say salmons. We can say shrimps. We can say lobsters, and so on. And so reanimating the words by just making a tweak can really have a powerful effect on us and on the people we talk to. And we are mirrors to one another. So when people hear us speak, they see themselves in us. And so don't underestimate changing the words around this. And that's why, coming back to the very first point, that's why I say plant-based meat. That's why I say plant-based milks. That's why I say animal-based meat and animal-based milks, right? So same thing around milk, right? Because, I mean, we know, I talked about this back in 2006 about how the dairy industry is threatened by the non-dairy milk industry. And so instead of changing the things that are contributing to their loss of sales, which is animal cruelty and the unhealthfulness of animal milk when humans consume it, they want to change the language of plant-based milks because they see them as a threat. So this is just, basic psychology 101. And I do predict that they're going to keep losing that battle. They're going to keep trying, but they're going to keep losing the battle because I do think that there will come a time that the dairy industry collapses completely. And I think it's going to happen in my lifetime, assuming I live another couple decades, which I plan to. And so this is an example where the dairy industry, they're trying to make it so that the non-dairy beverages, non-dairy milks, can't use the word milk. And of course, we're seeing this in the meat industry as well. The meat industry is also threatened by the plant-based meat success, and they are trying to make it illegal to use the word meat on products like plant-based meats. And so we're going to keep seeing this, but I think we're going to keep winning. And so it's the reason why I really encourage everyone who, at least who understands what I'm saying here, to normalize these words, to normalize plant-based meat, to normalize plant-based milk. I can definitely say that in my lifetime, or at least in the 20 years I've been doing this work, 25 years, what am I saying? 25 years I've been doing this work around veganism. I've been vegan 25 years and a vegan advocate for 25 years, but an animal advocate for 30 or more. But what I can say has changed in the last 25 years is now I do see the general public and the industries using words like goat's milk to refer to goat's milk, cow's milk to refer to cow's milk, almond milk to refer to almond milk, right? And so that's what I really encourage. Just call it what it is. I beg you not to use substitute. I beg you not to say normal when you're talking about cow's milk. I beg you not to say replacement when you're talking about a plant-based milk. I beg you not to change the word milk to spell M-Y-L-K. No. I encourage you to normalize the use of the word milk associated with whether it's a nut or a grain or a seed. So talk about almond milk, oat milk, hazelnut milk, rice milk, soy milk, coconut milk, or you could just say plant-based milk in general. And when you're referring to the animal lactations and secretions, fluids, and you could use those words too, again, in the right time and place, context, all of that. But I do think we should say cow's milk, animal lactations. I think we should call them what they are to just pull people out of, oh man, like, yeah, wait, what? Right? Because we're so desensitized when we just repeat them over and over and over again. And I mean it when I say secretions. I do use the word secretions and fluids because, again, I am mindful of when I say them, to whom I say them, but pulling us out of kind of just this sleepy, desensitized way of thinking about who we're eating and whose milk we're taking and whose flesh we're eating, all those things. Finding ways to do it so that it is provoking thought and not just necessarily trying to stir things up for the sake of it and make a point, because I'm not looking to be right, I'm looking to be effective. There are times where I will use the word secretions and people go, what? Products, sometimes I don't use because it commodifies the animal and their body parts, right? So secretions kind of has a different impact, and so does fluids and all of it. So that is what I recommend to you, is that we all just kind of consider the game we play with the language we use that ultimately, I think, in the end is harmful to us. I think it's harmful to the animals. It belittles animals. It minimizes their suffering. It commodifies their bodies. It commodifies the secretions that come out of their bodies. That includes eggs. That includes milk. I'll talk about chickens' eggs versus just eggs. I don't know whose eggs you're talking about. Could be, is it a robin's eggs? Is it a female human egg? I don't know. So I gotta say chickens' eggs, ducks' eggs, goose's eggs, geese's eggs, geese eggs, goose eggs. So finding ways to change the language so that we can hear what is really being said. And so practice it. Practice it for a week, practice it for 2 weeks, being mindful of the language you use to refer to the stuff you're eating or that someone else is eating. Call the stuff what it is. Call the animal meat what it is. Talk about plant-based meat. Plant-based milk versus animal-based meat, animal-based milk, right? Chickens versus chicken, fishes versus fish. Try it. I want to hear how it feels to you. I want to hear what kind of reactions you get. And I can't say this enough. Be mindful of the interactions you're having in the context in which you're using these words. And you're looking to bring people into the conversation, not shove them out of it. But try it and let me know how it goes. Back in 2006, I ended that episode by saying, another day we'll talk about the language we use that establishes animals as lower life forms, as inferior, and by virtue of that justifies our violence towards them, like calling people pigs or using expressions like kill two birds with one stone. Well, 18 years later, I can tell you I have a lot of content about that in the podcast here. Over at joyfulvegan.com, you can search for any of these terms. All of the podcast episodes are at joyfulvegan.com, but of course, wherever you listen to podcasts, do a search for them. And that goes for the Animology podcast as well. Remember, the Animology podcast was a short-lived podcast. I'm not creating new content for it anymore. I am putting more language episodes into Food for Thought podcast, but you can go find a lot of episodes over at Animology that did not come over to Food for Thought. And you can find a lot of this in Food for Thought, also in my books, also on my website, also in my articles, etc. So just head over to joyfulvegan.com. And if you are looking for something in particular and you can't find it, let me know and I'll see if I can help you. That, my friends, is it for today. I wish you much health and much happiness and much kindness and compassion. May your life be a reflection of your truth for the animals. This is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Thanks for listening.